do billionaires go crazy when Mamdani wants to open 5 public grocery stores? Mm-hmm. It's not because they think that the 5 public grocery stores are going to, like, put some other grocery store nearby out of business. And not just because they think they'll be inefficiently run and like that. It's because the very idea of it represents a threat. Trump world is based around a whole bunch of white guys who think that the reason that they are as fucked as they are is because people of color took their jobs.
Yeah.
But, that's not true. That is not it. It's not DEI that has made them what they are. It's capitalism that has made them what they are. Part of the virtue of class politics is like a know who your fucking enemy is politics. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Your enemy is not like, some guy who's nervous about you because he doesn't like the color of your skin. He may be your enemy in some real way, but he's not structurally your enemy. What you're structurally your enemy is the guy you work for. Yeah. That's your enemy. That's your class enemy.
Yeah.
Have you heard about class reductionism? Following Trump's election, you've probably heard a lot about identity politics, the meaning of class politics, and what type of politics the left should adopt. In 2024, Adolf Reed Jr. and Walter Benn Michaels published a book titled No Politics But Class Politics. In the book, they discuss their understanding of class politics and its place in progressive and leftist movements. Today, I'm sitting with Walter Michaels to discuss these questions. Walter is a literary and political theorist who taught at Hopkins, UC Berkeley, and the University of Illinois. Take a listen.
Walter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start from, just where we are right now. We are in your apartment here in New York City. Mamdani took office, and just before we started recording, you were looking at his income. He released his tax returns.
Yeah. See how much less he made than one of our previous mayors, Michael Bloomberg. And he makes much, 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 much less.
You were saying he makes in a year what Bloomberg makes in a day.
I don't know if anybody knows how much Bloomberg makes. It's almost incalculable. It's not Musk level, but incalculable. But Mamdani makes something like $150,000.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about this. What does this mean for you, for the city, the first self-professed socialist mayor?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, we moved here from Chicago, and we have basically a socialist mayor in Chicago, deeply identified with the teachers union in Chicago. In that sense, it wasn't a surprise. It was more of a surprise in New York in a way, because in New York, Chicago has the most radical sort of left major public union probably in the country. New York not. And when we moved here, Mamdani was polling at about 2%. And I frankly have been, but increasingly less so, skeptical about Mamdani. First of all, I thought no one thought he would win. Second of all, his talents he has tremendous public relations talents. He's just a very gifted performer. But the first thing that was impressive, which I think is useful for the left in general, was the level of organization. That is, people in the streets whom you would see all the time in every borough in the city when he was in the process of running in the primary, advocating for him. And very much on message, and this was a crucial thing, the message what is now called affordability. But that is a kind of like key word at this moment, because what it really means is equality. That is, New York's an expensive place to live. Truthfully, every place, if you have no money, is an expensive place to live. And Mamdani was laser focused on issues that related to what he called affordability. Mm-hmm. So symbolic or not symbolic, commitment, he just reaffirmed it yesterday, and they're starting to work on it, to public supermarkets, one in each borough, to making the buses free, to free childcare, a series of things which nobody has, right? And which he was committed to right from the start. And it was a universalist model. It's very striking now. One of the ways people try to go against him is saying, so we're saying that we should pay taxes so that rich people can have free childcare, where rich people can ride the bus free. And Mamdani understood right from the start, it's universalist. It's not means tested. We're not trying to figure out who should get it and who shouldn't get it. We say absolutely everybody deserves it. And it's been revelatory to me to see how successful that message has been. So the people who are arguing for me, I mean, way back in the day, the first Bernie Sanders campaign, when he was arguing for universal funding for higher education, Hillary Clinton came right away and said, taxpayers should pay for Trump's children being educated. And that's a pure Hillary Clinton Democratic kind of line, means tested. And Sanders is saying the meaning of universal is for everybody. We want to make it a right for every citizen. So the first thing has been that Mamdani understood that very well. And the second thing has been that he's been extremely effective in making it happen. So that, I mean, I'm a little bit embarrassed by it, but, I feel the first 100 days have been super successful. It's kind of moving to see it. It's moving to see the degree to which he's already begun to restore a sense that actually the state, the government, in this case, the city government, is actually something for the people, of the people, and by the people, and that we should both respect it and contribute to it, and that it has a responsibility to us. So the so-called sewer socialism thing, but that's super important. It was important in Milwaukee back when it was going on there, and it's important here that absolutely it's part of what a socialist government should do is make sure that public services actually work for the people, make sure they actually are not corrupt. And then other things, which he's balanced very brilliantly. So back in the sort of days of peak woke, 2020, 2021, there were two, I think, resolutions passed by the city council, which had the force of law. One of them was to produce I think it's called a true income estimate of what it costs to live in New York. So when you begin to think about poverty levels in New York, you begin to think not just some abstract number that was pulled out of national statistics, but what it actually costs to live in New York. And one was a racial equity commission. And Mamdani's put those both into effect, even though they are, in a way, fundamentally opposed to each other. He can bridge the opposition. They're opposed to each other because the great strength of the true income thing is that absolutely you want to find out who cannot afford to live in the city, and you want to begin to enact the measures that will make it possible for them to do so. And you want to have as accurate a measure of that as possible. The racial equity thing, it complicates that in a kind of bad way. It's just like it's a version of the means testing, the non-universality. The racial equity thing instead, what is obviously true, which is that the poor people in New York are disproportionately Black and Latino. But of course, what Mamdani understands, which is what liberal Democrats have never understood, is that the goal is not to make, Black people proportionately poor. It's not, no, we're not better off if, in fact, instead of Black people being some disproportionately high number of the poor, they're exactly the right number of the poor for the relation to population. And we're not better off if instead of Asians and white people being disproportionately rich, they are proportionally rich. Inequality doesn't get altered by the fact that the skin colors of the people in the different positions do it. So there's a way in which what you always wanted, from the universalism that's at the heart of socialism, is the idea that the point is to not have poor people. And that the question of discrimination, which is the kind of beating heart justification of what Adolf Reed and I have called left neoliberalism, that is basically like what the Democratic Party and major corporations have been committed to for the last 20 years. Their beating heart is, no, racism is at the heart of our problems. And if we try to eliminate racism, we're going to get more equality. And our point's always been, racism is a problem. One should absolutely work to overcome it. But in fact, you can empty the world of racism altogether, and you still have exactly the same level of inequality. Now you just have it disproportionately distributed instead of disproportionately distributed. And Mamdani totally gets that. So he puts these two things goes up there, they're kind of, he has to satisfy a certain kind of base, which exists both in the Democratic Socialist Party in New York, and indeed, especially in the relatively conservative black population of New York, where not black population as a whole, but black leadership, so-called, where in fact they're invested in what Reed calls clientelist politics. That a certain amount of power should go to black people, black representation at the top. You can't just ignore that. That's a fact of New York and American politics. But what you have to realize is that politics, the politics of distributing wealth proportionately, is distributing, power proportionally. That's an empty politics for the left. What the left needs is to actually redistribute wealth and redistribute it between the rich and the poor, not between the black and the white or the Asian and the Latino. And Mamdani understands that. I mean, the way he acts, he understands that. Yeah. What he talks about, he stays on message. So there's a way in which it's been striking to see that the closest thing to in effect, a kind of Sanders set of commitments is actually being enacted. And he's made a lot of progress in 100 days. So I'm a little less pessimistic about our future now than I was then. I mean, there are many things that work against it, and one doesn't even have to start listening to know what they are. And New York's a city, it's not a state, and it's for sure not a country. And Trump can make many of these things go away just by stopping being charmed by Mamdani. Yeah. So you can't count on the socialist you elect being able to charm Donald Trump. Yeah. That was that was just an add-on for us. And even with him being able to do that, you cannot count on it lasting. But nonetheless, the commitment to kind of a universalism has proven to be politically effective here in New York. And, for people who are committed to a class politics, it's not as if there is no working class anywhere outside New York. There's working class everywhere in this country. And it's imaginable that one could begin to think about what it would mean to put together working class politics in Mississippi, in Virginia, in California, as well as in New York City.
This is a really great point, and it takes me to my next question, which is you and Adolf, in your book, you talk about class politics a lot, and it is something that that has, in many cases, many meanings. It could mean multiple things. So what do we mean by class politics?
So basically, what we mean by class politics is that if you take the view that the fundamental structure of our economy is built on the exploitation of labor by capital, and take even a very mild vision of what that exploitation of labor by capital is, you can't sell something unless you sell it for greater than the price of the labor invested in it. That's what it means to make a profit. Then the functioning of our economy, when it functions best, is actually exploitative for the working class. You don't get profit without the labor of the working class. From a certain standpoint, I mean, within a Marxist tradition, there are many of them not so interesting or enlightening debates about who exactly belongs to which class. And I don't have a kind of view on that, but it's not relevant to your audience, and not so far as I can tell relevant to any political thing I've ever done in my life. Because on a certain level, for example, professors don't belong to the working class.
Right.
Often not so much now as people's salary, as the profession gets adjunctified. But back in the day, people made more. They're like managers. They're this and there's that. But, we were talking earlier before we started recording. When I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago, one of the things we did was we formed a faculty union. And when you form a faculty union, you realize right away that you totally are working people and that you are negotiating with your bosses, in this case, your deans, your provosts, the presidents, and that they treat you just like management treats its workers. So they don't pay you what you want to be paid. They pay you what they think they should pay you, and the reason you're having, your union is to try to fight for more, and they can say no. And they do say no, and they don't argue with you about it. They just say no, and then you can try to make them do it. You can strike. You've got your interests and the people whom you work for interests are, in certain respects, fundamentally opposed. That doesn't mean you can't that there aren't good bosses. It doesn't mean you can't reach agreements which are helpful, but it means that in a certain sense, all faculty, whatever they were teaching, whatever their relative positions were, more or less privileged, more or less highly paid, whatever their sexual identities were, whatever their racial identities were, in relation to management, in relation to the basic structure of their job, we all stood in exactly the same position. Mm-hmm. So then someone says, yeah, but faculty, that's one thing. You're still not working class. But I say, yeah, there are obvious ways culturally in which we're working class, but I'm not so interested in the cultural question. I'm not interested in class as an identity. What we're interested in is class as a structural position where basically it's wage labor. You get paid for what you do, and most of us can't control we get paid for what we do. So within that, there are two ways of thinking about, how to make that thing work. And one of them, which is characteristic, and it's what a capitalist economy really, really wants when it's being most effective, is you make it work through enabling people to rise in that. So if you stick with the professor version, someone who's really good at being a professor starts out by making X, but they get promoted, they make this, and they rise and in effect from their class, or they ascend, as it were, to the top of their class. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem of inequality. That just redistributes the problem of inequality. So what a core class politics wants is not to make certain members of the class available for promotion. It wants to raise the class as a whole. To raise the class as a whole, it wants to, in effect, attack the very idea of profit. So the minute you start thinking about class politics as a whole, you start thinking about what is in the end an anti-capitalist politics. I mean, that's what, that's why Mamdani gets people super, super mad. You want to say, why do billionaires go crazy when Mamdani wants to open 5 public grocery stores? It's not because they think that the 5 public grocery stores are going to put some other grocery store nearby out of business. And not just because they think they'll be inefficiently run and like that. It's because the very idea of it represents a threat. Well, the idea that what you want is for-profit grocery stores. Yeah. You want ones where people are being paid and where what they're being paid by corporations. The corporations are taking profits out of it. So it has a very powerful symbolic level to it. And if you can make it work, it has a more than symbolic level to it. So what we mean by class politics is basically that. If you think about the working class, you define the working class as expansively as possible, but you define it above all in relation to people, the people for whom we work, the corporations we work for, even the state when we work for the state. Then what you want to do is represent the interests of those people, and those people get to decide what their interests are. I mean, the virtue of a union is that people would always say to us, well, when the union comes in, you won't be able to speak for yourselves, but we are the union. We can speak for ourselves. And that doesn't mean all unions are equally good. It doesn't mean unions are a panacea. But it means the whole point of the union was, instead of speaking for ourselves each as an individual, no, we speak for ourselves as a group. So that for us, for me, that was a very powerful experience, the experience of organizing the union. For me, especially because I was making a lot of money. I didn't have a problem that I didn't need to make more money. But I ran a department that had 45 adjunct faculty who, when that whole process started, were paid between $24,000 and $26,000 a year to teach 6 courses.
Wow.
Now, 15 years later, the starting salary, I believe, at the last contract for those people was $65,000. How did that happen? It did not happen because, each one got individually promoted and so on. So it happened because the faculty as a whole insisted this was wrong and fought for it and transformed these people's lives. And in the very start of it, I kept on thinking, if I were adjunct faculty, the thing I'd worry most about would be I'm only on 1-year contracts. I can get fired any day. And that is a bad thing. But actually, no. It was a union. It was not like my decision as their boss oh, I was their boss. What should I fight for? It was like the union's decision, including them.
Yeah.
What should they fight for? And at the beginning, they cared much more about money. I think their basic idea was, I don't worry that much about getting fired because right now I can barely survive as it is.
Yeah.
Let's start paying me enough money so I can worry about my security. So for the first 5 years, we just fought for more money. Mm-hmm. But then actually we did then start to fight for more security. Interestingly, it's easier to win more money in that case than it was to win more security, although some gains were made there too. But part of the point is that those decisions were not being made by individual adjunct faculty saying, I want this and I want that. They were not being made by their boss, the middle manager, in this case me. They were made by a union. And I was part of their union because part of the faculty, and I had a vote. I had one vote.
Yeah.
The tenure track faculty in my department, there were about 35 of them. Altogether, we had 35 votes. The non-tenure track faculty in my department had 45 votes. So we didn't vote by department, but all these people whose lives were affected by this got to vote on what we should do. Mm-hmm. And it's a useful lesson in how to begin to think about what people's interests are, is to ask them what their interests are, and then go beyond asking them, realize that they have the ability, help create a context in which they have the ability to act on their own interests, and in which you get to collaborate with them in doing it.
Yeah. So this is really interesting, the definition of class in a relational model, if
there's
you will.
No such thing on our view as class. It's not relational.
Yeah. And
of course, in a classical Marxist sense, the whole goal of the working class is to end the working class.
Right.
And it's not to appreciate the working class.
Yeah.
It's to end it.
And in that, I think, opens up all of these questions that are coming up right now, which is, how does the idea of class changes with changing work modalities? With all the gig economy, the kind of, the unstable employment, the illusion that if you work for Uber or DoorDash, you don't have a boss, you're just working on your own.
So, the classic response first, and it's not false to say it makes it harder to organize. But on the other hand, and Uber's a perfect example. Uber has fought unionization, and they fought unionization on what principle? The principle was these guys are their own bosses.
Yeah.
We're all capitalists here. They're selling us their labor. We're just one capitalist dealing with another. It's the same argument, or a version of the argument used against unionizing faculty at private universities. Mm-hmm. You're not really a worker. Where the union has been successful, and it has been now, it's been politically, that it's now California, you can unionize Uber. In New York, there are versions of that. It turns out that even though the guys are all alone in their individual cars, they recognize very quickly what their common problems are. Mm-hmm. When we were starting our faculty, it's not like faculty are all down on the workforce, on the labor thing. You're passing on the part of the car, if we're all imagining ourselves as industrial workers in 1928, and I'm doing the next thing to it. You're in your audience, you're in your classroom, you're in your office, I'm in mine. We don't see each other. We don't even know each other, right? Mm-hmm. But when we used to go around, when we were trying to organize faculty members, the first thing we do is we go around to someone, we'd say, so what do you name us the 2 or 3 things you like most about your job? And then what are the 2 or 3 things you like least about your job? These are people who didn't know each other, didn't see each other, had never talked to each other. They all had roughly the same answers. They're individuals who had idiosyncratic answers.
Of course.
So when you start asking Uber drivers, you don't have to get them all in the same room to sort of say, so guys, what do you like about the job? Relative autonomy, which is one thing that people push about, like lack of safety, lack of job security, vulnerability to the evaluations of the riders, above all, lack of pay. Those are all things they don't like about their jobs. What you need is to be able to get them all together and see what it is that they have in common. So I think one of the things Uber has taught is that the fragmentation of the working place that people have been worried about is very real and may make it harder to organize. But as long as people can be given the opportunity to see what they have in common with the other workers, it does not matter if they're riding in the same car. They're having the same experience. And the advantage of this kind of relatively abstract but also super concrete way of thinking about the working class is this, is that we don't need all the myths of the industrial working class. We've lost those myths for sure.
Yeah.
You know, all the people pouring out of the factory at the end of the day. Those factories are, in the U.S., most of them are closed, right? But all the people who just go around New York, from the time I used to live here when I was a kid to now, there's a huge difference right away you see in the streets. If you just drove in today, you already saw it, which is that these guys on bikes everywhere. Mm-hmm. They're delivering for Amazon. They're delivering for DoorDash. They're everywhere, little motorbikes all through the city. There are lanes for them. It's like there are more people in the streets than I ever remember there being. So are these guys all working together? No, sometimes you see them together because there turn out to be certain kinds of like restaurants where they all hang out. So you go by a restaurant in the evening, there are 60 of these bikes parked out there. But they're all doing the same fucking job. Mm-hmm. They all have a good idea of what they like and what they don't like about that job. And the idea of unionizing them that makes complete sense. Right? They don't need to be all together in the room for them to be unionized. Mm-hmm. They need to have a vote at some point. You can develop, any good union is going to develop opportunities for more social relation with that. But we don't have to look at them and see, but they for sure don't look like the classic industrial working class. Yeah. They look like a bunch of Hispanic guys driving little cabs around, little bikes around New York. But they totally are the working class. And they totally are susceptible to all the arguments we always make about, if you're on the left, socialists, about what the working class needs. Yeah. And, and these are guys who have been tempted to vote for Trump, because what they're being told. So I remember a panel that my colleague Adolf Reed was on, and that I was in the audience for in Chicago, where another member of the panel was the current mayor of Chicago. It was not that a mayor of Chicago. It was just a member of the Chicago Teachers Union and a teacher. And Brandon Johnson was saying, it's really hard teaching these kids, mainly black kids, poor black schools, that they have a chance to succeed in America. And I remember our response being, Adolf from the thing and mine from the audience right away, that's not what we should be teaching them. Mm-hmm. We should be teaching them is that actually it stands, they have almost no chance to succeed. What they need to do to succeed is stop thinking of themselves as the possible exception that will prove the rule, the one person who will rise to the top, and realize, no, you've got to all rise together. Mm-hmm. So when you look at these guys are pursuing the so-called American dream. The American dream is always the dream of rising from your class into a higher class. But the value of the union is what provided a model of what it means for the whole class to rise. So you look around at those guys, you think, yeah, they are ripe for organization. Just like Amazon, hard to organize, but ripe for organization. Mm-hmm. All those places. And again, I do have, it's hard to do that in the U.S. The laws are against it. A lot of the culture is against it. Some of the conditions of work are against it. But the Mamdani campaign gives you a little vision of what it might be like for it to succeed. And again, that is the essence of the class program, which is that in terms of your relation to capital, in terms of your relation just to money, where you get it by working for somebody else. You are just you're not, one of the real catastrophes in intellectual life in the university years ago was when the notion of marginalized populations became the crucial thing. Mm-hmm. And we had to think about the problem of marginalized populations. Well, we certainly should worry about the problem of marginalized populations. But the fundamental engine of our inequality is not a marginalized population. The working class as a class is not marginalized. The working class as a class is absolutely central. Mm-hmm. It is. And almost all of us belong to it. So if you organize as a class, you're no longer worried that how can we give a voice to the marginalized people. What we want to do is say, that's a worry we should have, but that's a worry that has to be secondary to the fundamental thing of absolutely giving a voice to, not giving a voice to, but just becoming a part of the voice of the working class, which is like everybody, virtually everybody. Yeah. And indeed, in the U.S., it becomes more and more like everybody as more and more money accrues, not just to the top 10%, not just the top 1%, but to the top 0.01%, and then beyond that to Musk and Bezos and 5 other guys.
Yeah, yeah. So that takes us to the term that is being used in many circles on the wide expanse of the left, which is class reductionism. What does class reductionism mean?
So in theory, what class reductionism means, it was always like there's a great novel by, it's not really a great novel, but there's a good novel by, I think his best novel is, sorry, I'm being an English professor here, is Giovanni's Room. But James Baldwin wrote a really interesting novel called Another Country. And in it, it's semi-autobiographical. They're two young men growing up in some godforsaken city, I can't remember town where, and they're both discovering that they're gay. And one of them says to him, well, we should go off and, in effect, he's saying, have sex. The other guy says, but people, they're just looking for us to do that. And the kid says something like, hey, if you got the name, you might as well play the game. Mm-hmm. So class reduction is always used the way queer used to be used. It's used as an insult. And the insult was class reductionists thought that the economy was the only thing that mattered, and that questions of organizing people, questions of people's identity, that's the way it is used now, questions of motivation, questions that went beyond the structure of the economy were just not taken seriously. Nobody has ever gone out and said, I'm a class reductionist. It's always a term of insult. I've actually tried to, as we say in English, re-signify it, just following the Another Country model. If you got the name, man, play the game. Because nothing bad follows from class reduction, actually. In fact, they were sufficiently unsuccessful in using that against us that somebody invented a thing called class abstraction. And Adolf and I now get regularly accused of being class abstractionists. Mm-hmm. But it actually is a way of just trying to do the same things, abstracting class out of the reality of the situation and using this kind of abstract thing to beat people with. But class is the most concrete thing in the world. Mm-hmm. Again, it goes back to I'm sorry, we're doing the same job here. We're getting paid by the same people. We're in the same situations. I think it's super concrete. In effect now, class reduction is you don't pay enough attention to intersectionality. Mm-hmm. You don't pay enough attention to the other competing forms. But there's a reason. This is why I'm kind of committed to the class reduction model. Intersectionality is another form of, as far as I'm concerned, neoliberal ideology. Why? Because intersectionality is race, gender, and class. So what's the problem with race? The problem with race is that you don't want people to treat you unequally because of your racial identity. You want to be able to overcome racism. And sex is exactly the same thing. You don't want to be treated unequally because you're a woman. You don't want to be treated unequally because you're gay. Class is, first of all, not the same thing. Merely to belong to the working class is to be treated unequally. Mm-hmm. You can overcome classism. You can overcome, people often talk about, and I talk about being a professor here a lot in this, but it's not just because I am and have been one. It's because I do think that most of your politics, you can organize it in your workplace. So people are always complaining, and not incorrectly, that professors increasingly come from the upper middle class. Mm-hmm. And that's a form of classism. And that is a kind of problem, I think, for the equality of access to the job. But classism is also a form of discrimination. We discriminate against people who are the lower class. But the problem with being lower class or being working class, in this case, is not that you're a victim of discrimination. That's a problem when you're trying to get out of the working class. Mm-hmm. So you go to you go to the job interview. I once had a student, so when I was at Hopkins and at Berkeley, my students came from the upper middle class. They were comfortable being interviewed. I mean, they had professional anxieties. We all do. Yeah. But they were socially. I remember one of my first students at UIC, a very, very bright student, published recently a very, very good book. He went to be interviewed at the University of Pennsylvania. He just couldn't believe he was being interviewed at the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League school. Mm-hmm. He'd never been in an Ivy League anything before in his life. He was just the fact that it was a catastrophe, as you can easily imagine, he didn't even know how to behave. At that point, he lost everything, was secondary to him. So that was a problem of classism. It's a real problem. You don't want prejudice anywhere. But again, if he gets that job, he just gets out of his class. Mm-hmm. So if you think about race, gender, and class as intersectional, you think all these things are things where you want to avoid structural prejudice against them. But the problem of being working class has not to do with structural prejudice. It's built into the structure of the economy, not into the structure of how people feel about you. People can feel fine about you, but if they're paying you like $14 an hour, you're screwed no matter what they feel about you. So part of the point about the class reductionist model is to say, as against intersectionality is, like anti-racism in general, a class project. It's a class project because it understands the basic elements of unfairness, let's say in the economy, as effects of prejudice, effects of discrimination. And people from the working class can be just as much victims of discrimination as in virtue of their class identity as they can in virtue of their racial or sexual identity. But, the socialist or let's say the class reductionist response to that is to say, yeah, but imagine a world in which there are none of those things. There's a problem, none of those forms of discrimination. There's a problem belonging to the working class in the first place. The problem belonging to the working class is you belong to the working class. That is, your labor is exploited. What you have in common with everybody else is more important than what you don't have in common with them. The discrimination part is discrimination that keeps you from rising out of your class. What we want as socialists is to rise with the class. And that's a fundamental distinction. And it's a fundamental difference in politics. Again, I keep on citing Mamdani because we started with that. Mamdani sort of gets that. And getting that, it makes a real difference. But a lot of what's now gets called woke, but I prefer to think of it just like a lot of anti-discrimination politics is based on never getting that, or getting it and saying, yeah, that's important too. But really, if you look at what the American left has been doing, why has the right been so successful at focusing on DEI? Because the American left has been so completely committed to it, and now the right just wants its own version of it.
Yeah.
The right wants poor white people to think, again, that some black professor is the reason they can't succeed. And that if there were just more white professors, which God knows, in reality, there are already plenty of white professors. But if there were just somehow more white professors, right, more white kids at Harvard because no more affirmative action, then that's good for who?
Yeah.
So Trump, who knows what he thinks, but a certain version of the right wants to say, that's good for all you white people out there. But that's just like the guy in the novel I was telling you about. We're all white people here. If there are more white people at Harvard, it's good for white people. You're a white guy, it's good for you. But then again, that's your racial brother. Whereas what the socialists want to tell you is, no, that's your class enemy. He's not your brother. He's not working for you at Harvard.
Yeah.
He's working for himself at Harvard. If he represents anything, it's other middle class people or other upper middle class people. So, part of the virtue of class politics is like a know who your fucking enemy is politics. Your enemy is not like, some guy who's nervous about you because he doesn't like the color of your skin. He may be your enemy in some real way, but he's not structurally your enemy. What you're structurally your enemy is the guy you work for. Yeah. That's your enemy. That's your class enemy.
Yeah.
And he hasn't turned into your friend because, I was once, so I won't do names, but I was giving a lecture at Harvard. And coming out of the lecture with a friend, a guy whom I like and whose name you would recognize immediately. Anybody watching this, because he's on TV a lot. And saying, and there's a guy on the street who's a panhandler guy. And the guy, my friend, gave him like $1. The guy took $1. And the guy who was panhandling was black, and my friend is black. And he said, here you go, brother. And the guy said, thank you, brother. And I remember thinking at the same time, brother. Now there are two ways in which that could be meant. One is, brother, we are all brothers. In which case, that's a universalist motive. And the other is, no, man, we're black guys, brothers here. And we're recognizing a certain kind of kinship, even though I'm a professor at Harvard. And you, on that street corner, are not a professor at Harvard. So you just want to think, what is real brotherhood involved with? So the real brotherhood is a brotherhood that's going to be the brotherhood of the working class. Where we are, all black and white, unite and fight was the old version of that. But that's not a sentimental going back to what it was. We want it more now than ever. Again, Mamdani's been effective at doing that.
Yeah.
The point being is that, but that's what it means, again, to go back to your, a persistent thread through your questions is like, so what's so special about a class politics?
Yeah.
And that's what's special about a class politics, is recognize actually who your brothers are and who they aren't. And create a world in which everybody is.
Right. So I'm going to dig a little deeper into the granular kind of, the attack or concerns or problems that people raise about quote-unquote class reductionism, which is, I think, the argument that, for example, we want that having more black or brown people in CEOs of Fortune 500 is not, any serious person on the left. This is just not going to change anything. But there are questions that people are asking about. Can we have, or will socialist politics be interested in the granular, that it's related to race, racial crimes, lynchings in one way or another, reproductive health, things that affect indeed, that of course have a class dimension, but that do affect people also because of or due to a particular...
Yeah, so the first thing to say, the answer is going to be yes, but the first thing to say is that do have a class dimension. That is, thinking about just think about, again, wages for a second.
Yeah.
So the problem is black people disproportionately represented in the bottom 20% of the American population. If you launch programs, a whole society, which one of the fundamental commitments is to rise up the bottom 20%, not make sure that we do some good things for the black bottom 20%, but rise up the whole bottom 20%. Black people, just as they are disproportionately belonging to the 20%, are disproportionately benefited by doing that. Not because they're black, but because they're poor. So there's built into the universalism is that on a certain level, the structural things that have precisely produced racial imbalance now, those structural things are the things you're trying to get rid of. So if you just never mention race once and just said, I don't care if you're a black, white, or whatever, but what we're doing this is for poor people, for working poor people, for whatever, you're disproportionately going to benefit the black poor. So the first thing to say is that, yeah, on one level, the socialist commitment is already committed to solving. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates once said that the biggest mark of white people's indifference to black people is the racial wealth gap. That's exactly wrong. What you want to say is the problem is, how do you solve the racial wealth gap? By solving the wealth gap. I'm not interested in creating more rich black people. You are saying now you think no one on the left thinks that. I hear that a lot, but I actually don't believe it for a second. I heard it just today from someone who says, well, no, everyone on the left in the last 10 years has been black-pilled by yours and Adolf's arguments about this. But I'll believe that one. I don't believe it at all. I don't believe that. They don't think, okay, so anti-racism is a class project. No, what they think is, yeah, we got to talk more about class. So fine. But here's the point. So the first thing is, yeah, if you want to take care, a lot of this will be taken care of. In medical things, again, it's a mark of our real persistence about race. People want to say, well, if we factor out like economic stuff, it's still the case in reproductive health, that in childbirth issues, that black women are. So you want to say, absolutely, we should do something about that. There's nothing in it. There is not a single anti-discrimination measure that any of us, the relatively small number of people occupying our political position, has ever opposed. People talk about the excesses of woke and all that. I have never once denounced, and don't denounce now, the excesses of woke. I'm not saying, oh no, God, we leave the trans people behind. That's a bridge too far. On the contrary, trans people deserve every right. There are going to be arguments, medical things that I'm not an expert on, but the point is, trans people deserve every right. The point is not that people don't deserve those rights. The point is that granting those rights, everybody, not even granting them, we don't get to grant them, they should have them already. Securing those rights for everyone is not in itself a left politics. It doesn't redistribute wealth to everybody. But it doesn't mean you then give it up. No, of course it goes with that. But the point about it is that if you just do what we've been doing, which is focusing on securing everybody's rights, and fighting the racism all the way and saying, no, look, I can prove to you that even when you take the class stuff away, black people are still at a disadvantage in this. That's right to be shown, but it only makes sense to show if you're already saying, but wouldn't the first thing be the most obvious thing, which is by far the biggest disparities in healthcare, are class-based, are money-based.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to have a society in which people are actually devoting a lot of research energy into showing that even if one factored that stuff out, there's still racial differences? That's exactly getting it backwards. One wants to say, oh my God, we solved the class problem. Everybody gets serious universal health care, and yet somehow black women are still having more serious issues of childbirth. We have to solve that one too. But if you lead with the first one, what are you leading with? You're leading with, no, the problem is racism. And I want to show that even if, theoretically, we solve the class problem, we would still have a race problem. So what I'm saying is, the class problem is responsible for about 80% of healthcare differentials. Mm-hmm. Let's solve that problem. We should keep on trying to solve the other one too. And there's not a moment against it. No so-called class reductionist thinks that therefore civil rights should be in any way lessened or abused. No class reductionist I ever know of thinks that trans rights aren't crucial. We all think all those things are crucial. Mm-hmm. But we all think that all those things done without a fundamental alteration in the class structure are just ways of defending a society in which the engine of inequality, the very way that people make their living, right, is actually left intact, while the epiphenomena of that inequality are dealt with. So that it's absolutely the case that the more granular levels, when I wrote The Trouble with Diversity, which was like 2006, I think, which is when all this stuff began for me. Mm-hmm. The very first question I was ever asked in an election, I gave a million lectures about this, but in a society where everybody was equal, economically equal, that doesn't mean that people wouldn't be racist. And you might say, for sure. But the first thing it does mean is the thought experiment. No one's imagining a society in which everyone's equal, but it imagines that a lot of the consequences of racism would become irrelevant. Mm-hmm. Nobody would be living in a bad house because of their racism. Nobody would be living in because of road. Now, a lot of it doesn't mean, would there still be consequences? There would be. Does it mean if they'd be wrong? Totally would be wrong. But we're not saying do this and don't do that. We're saying if you don't do this as your core, then the other is nothing but the class project of justifying the inequalities you got by saying, as long as you're not being treated badly because of racism, you're okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of the order of things. It's the matter of that fundamentally without a project of...
Exactly right. It's not a matter of the order of things. Exactly right. It's not a matter it's that without this as the base, the class reduction part, the class primacy part, is that if you don't do that, then nothing can eliminate the fundamental discrepancies. And in fact, we attempt to eliminate those inequalities you are eliminating serve only to justify the ones that are basic, that is the ones where you deserve. And healthcare is a good example because healthcare, it is quite clear. There are certain areas where you started with, where if you do, I've read innumerable things about this because for a while it's kind of my line of work. And yeah, there totally are areas where factoring out for class, you still get inequalities. Mm-hmm. And you should totally deal with those. But I've always been struck by the fact that for grant-getting purposes, you really wanted to be able to say, see, this is a function of racism.
Yeah.
And then you'd have whole things devoted to saying, so we have to, the way to begin to solve our problems here is we have to get more anti-racist doctors. I just think, no, the first way to solve the problem would be to get everybody to a doctor who knew what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And then, weed out the anti-racist ones, the racist ones while we're doing it. But the fundamental problem here is of American healthcare is not that when you go to the doctor, the guy's a little racist or a lot racist. The fundamental problem with American healthcare is that it's really hard to get to go to the doctor in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that when you get those bills, we all know what system our healthcare system is in. So you got an increasing privatization of the healthcare system. You've got, I'm on Medicare now. So Medicare itself is pretty good, but all your life, the whole thing's trying to be dragged over to Medicare Advantage plans, which is ways of privatizing and ripping people off and making a profit. So is there racism involved in that? I'm sure there are. They take advantage of black people when they can. They take advantage of they'll take advantage of any way they can take advantage of. But the fundamental problem be secured by universal health care for everybody. And if you can do that, then yeah, you've got all these other problems that just don't go away. And you've got to deal with those. But if you don't do that, it doesn't matter what you bet the other stuff. It's just the best version will just be rich black people will be taken care of as well as rich white people.
Yeah.
So should rich black people be taken care of as well as rich white people? Yes. But the point is everybody should be taken care of as well as everybody else.
Yeah.
Not that the rich people of all colors should benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. So at the end of our interviews, the name of the podcast is Vital Signs. And so we ask about vital signs, in your view, in two ways. One, vital signs almost like in a medical way. What are the signs that you pay attention to? What are you paying attention to, or that we should pay attention to, that gives us an idea as to where things are going in terms of, class politics in this country?
And what are the other kind of vital signs?
The other
so
side,
I know what the distinctions are before I get too deep.
The other thing is almost a sign as in where to go. So like, what is the direction that we need to go? So things that we pay attention to know where things are going and the direction that we need to head to.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably sucking at both these, really. In terms of the direction we need to go, the second one is a little bit easier. I mean, again, if you'd asked me that like 6 months ago, I would have been. So some guy just put an article online which began by saying, 10 years ago, I sat in a room where Walter Benn Michaels and Adolf Reed told us the left had to choose between, anti-discrimination and anti-exploitation. And the left did choose. We made the wrong choice, and here's where we are. And that article ends with me saying to the guy, which I did say to him at some point, my current view is fuck them all. So my current view is less fuck them all now than it was, and it's largely because it is true. Maybe I'm just old and sentimental. For sure I'm old. I do think that the kind of ability to take the DSA left, which has largely been a kind of race reductionist version, is what we call them, and actually make those guys and a whole bunch of people who think class is the crucial thing and that working class is a structural thing, make those guys kind of play together nicely. Actually, that's a really good sign. To me, that's a really good sign.
Yeah.
So the vital sign of looking for hope is there. And I know some people think, yeah, you can do it in New York, you can't do it elsewhere. I actually think you could do it anywhere because the basic conditions exist everywhere. So that the vital signs of what to look for in terms of what's actually happening. Yeah, I'm kind of catastrophist on that one. I mean, I think that what's actually happening is pretty bad. And I don't really think, I mean, it's made worse and scarier by AI, just because of AI's effect on labor we were talking about before. But I do think that would be a thing to look for. To me, in terms of the midterm political meaning of this, we look for what happens when you begin to get unemployment, or I can't remember the phrases for when you're getting a job lower than the one you thought you would get. Right? But there is some kind of economic term for it. What begins to happen when that begins to affect people? And why is that important? It's important because it's a sort of small number, but you want people to change things. You really have to change it, through the working class. I mean, and that's been a big problem for the Democratic Party. And I mean, I think the Democratic Party has no clue how to deal with that. I think the core way to deal with that is to be more quiet about trans kids in sports. It just has no idea. Or to try to work out some kind of compromise about Palestine, which is impossible. You got to bite the bullet and say, free Palestine. But I think that the idea of the way to sort of organize the working class is for more people to begin to understand themselves as belonging to the working class. And that's not an abstract theoretical way. It's by beginning to experience what it means to belong to the working class, by experiencing their own precarity, by experiencing the failure of their own expectations, by stopping preaching the promise of the American dream, by having them realize kind of abruptly that if it's true about the American dream, they certainly are not the beneficiaries of it. Maybe it was their parents were, maybe their grandparents were. So that takes the form of all kinds of resentment, misplaced resentment, anti-boomer stuff. It's not the boomers, it's just their good fortune that that was a rising economy. We haven't had that since 1978. But when people begin to sort of generalize from their own experience, they say, oh, no, it's not the boomers who did it. It's not the black guys who did it. It's not even the professors who did it. Although the professors are certainly obnoxious and worthy of a certain amount of contumely. It's not the professors who did it. It's the fucking structure of the economy that does it. Then, that produces a kind of sense that, on the one hand, you're in trouble, because when those people who had expectations feel that the world is failing them, they're going to find people to blame. And, if they're a certain version of the right now, they're going to find the Jews of all people to blame. They're going to find woke to blame. They're going to find anti-woke to blame. They're going to find a whole bunch of things to blame. So, the mission is to say, no, what we have to do is blame the right thing. And the right thing basically is to blame the structure of capitalism. So the bad sign is going to be when things get even worse the way they're getting worse, and people are blaming the wrong people every way out. I mean, the classic version's already taken place. There's a little magazine called Jacobin, Left magazine. The very first issue of Jacobin, before it was online or anything, had an interview with me on it. And it was after Get the Trouble with Diversity. We were talking about immigration. And immigration then was a kind of issue, but not that big an issue, because Bush talked a good line about keeping immigrants out of the country while, as a welcome wagon, come in. So you want people filling these jobs, what you wanted, like a nativist kind of line. So we're actually doing this now. But I remember saying then, look, part of the problem here is that you have people, not anywhere near as bad now as then, but you have people who actually, even in the top 20% of income levels, they're like in the 10 to 20%, they've noticed that they're not rising anymore. And that the top 10% is going way past them. And that among there's a whole other people emerging. And who do they blame? They blame guys coming across the border from Mexico. But capitalism is what they blame. Guys coming across the border from Mexico are not the problem. And what that's double down on. I mean, Trump got elected by blaming people who are coming across the border. And then within that, blaming people who've already been here, by producing this whole kind of nativist fantasy. So what is the point of the nativist fantasy? The nativist fantasy is just writ large, we were talking about before. Who they think are the right white people are all the right white people. And what's the point of them being all the right white people? That the rich white people and the poor white people are all white people together. That's a way of saying, if you're the poor white people, we're not your problem. Musk is not your problem. Like the immigrants, your problem. So that's been the most powerful form of taking a class problem and redescribing it as, in this case, a racial problem. So that's just getting worse and worse and worse. And the job of the left is to try to redescribe it. And you don't redescribe it by saying, no, you got to be nicer to people who belong to different races. You don't redescribe it by saying, you're immoral because you're a racist. You redescribe it by saying, dude, that's not what's happening. What's happening is you're getting fucked in the same way we're getting fucked, and we're getting fucked by capitalism. So you absolutely have to insist against the nativism. But the first way of insisting against the nativism is saying, it's just like they're telling you something is the problem when it's not the problem. Trans people are not the problem. What do you care? Who they sleep with? What do you care how they identify? What do you care about any of that? If they're involved in the same world you're involved in, the things you care about are the things day to day to day that you live. But, we get it always backwards. That is, we don't put the class thing first. And the point of putting the class thing first is that we're all in that together. Mm-hmm. So, and we can't solve it all together by saying, why can't we all just get along? Why is there so much? Because there's a good reason for there being so much, you don't want to say quarrelsomeness, but violence. Mm-hmm. And it's because we're at unparalleled levels of inequality, and people feel that, and they have very, very different ways of expressing their anger because of it. And most of their ways of expressing their anger because of it are really bad. And the job of the left is to actually help us all, express our anger in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So that's not super. What diagnostic value of the last 10 minutes is, I do not know. That's sort of like going too long. But anyway, that's my view.
Walter, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been
glad to be involved, and I wish you guys good fortune.
Thank you so much.
Making some difference.
That's the hope. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. I hope you learned as much as I did. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and make sure to join our Patreon for exclusive content that you don't want to miss. The conversation continues on the Vital Signs Substack, Instagram, and Facebook page. Let us know your thoughts in the comments and any impact this conversation may have on your thinking. See you next time.